maybe what I would call my personal racial awakening. I'm putting quotes around that, or the beginning of my personal racial awakening. Because I grew up in a small rural town in Colorado where there wasn't diversity. There were actually probably about 25% of the population is Latino or Mexican American. And that was just kind of we didn't really even talk about that. I didn't realize that a quarter of my friends in school were of Mexican descent. They were just friends. There wasn't a racial divide there, or at least not for the kids. I don't know about the adults. But for the most part, I literally grew up not thinking about race. And I'm not saying, oh, I was colorblind. Like I just literally didn't think about it. And of course, my parents, their hearts are in the right place. They taught me all the right things about equality. But they had similar backgrounds to me, and those kind of beliefs, they do, I think, hold equitable beliefs. They were never challenged because they grew up in similar small towns, predominantly white. And it just wasn't something we thought about, and definitely not something we talked about openly, besides the cursory should and shouldn'ts. So it wasn't until I went to college that I actually really got to know people of color and different colors well. And I remembered two pivotal moments. One was one of my Black girlfriends talked about being Black all the time. Just phrases or distinctions, like, oh, a Black girl would never do that, or that kind of thing. And I just remember sitting back and thinking, I never think about being white. Like, it's just not, because I guess I grew up in the situation where I was the default. I never thought about it. I'm like, why does she talk about being Black all the time? And it took me a while to learn, and in talking with her about, she's reminded every single day in a lot of ways that she's Black, or at least that she's different than the kind of quote unquote norm, or she's just reminded that she's different. So I remember talking through that. And then I also, for the first time, I went to this conference. I was like a college student volunteer for this high school conference that took place in Cleveland. And I didn't even think about it going. It was a conference about fostering peace and teaching kids not violent, but peaceful strategies for their own inner peace as well as global peace. It was a really hippie thing. But I went as the college student kind of proctor for this conference. But it was a high school conference in Cleveland. So it was pretty much 100% Black students and 100% almost Black administrators. So that meant that being in that room with about 200 or 300 Black people was the first time I had ever been the minority in a room, ever. I mean, besides being a woman, you do feel some difference being the only woman in the room or one of the few, but that was the first time that I felt what it was really like to be different in an outnumbered situation or minority situation. And everybody was there was no problems. Everybody was wonderful to me. There was no tension. It was all good. But I felt it, even though everybody was treating me perfectly fine. And so just those two experiences of, for the first time, really getting to know some minority friends and talking to them about this and thinking about race, and then having it being kind of thrown in your face all day, every day, and then experiencing it actually being the minority, those were eye-opening for me. Yeah. And I think they're just a lot of my friends and family, my white friends and family, that have just not ever, either never had those experiences, never been open to them, or just haven't used the brain power and had the kind of journey into empathy and sympathy for that experience.
So you don't feel like when you're connecting with other white friends, Caucasian friends, that they have that same level of experience of self-reflection of being the outsider. They don't have those things shared.
Some do, but lots don't. And
it's just not something that's talked about.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I have, of course, talked to white friend, well, not friends, family, because if they're not my friend anymore. But I've talked to white people who have negative feelings about minorities or pretty much anybody different from them in a variety of ways. So I definitely have racists in my family, and I have people around me who disagree with me and are wrong. in their worldviews that I've talked to about this. But I'm talking like the majority of the people that the white people that I interact with just don't think about race in the same way because they have never had to. It
Hmm.
hasn't been thrown in their face every day like it is to people who feel who are a minority.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. Quentin, what's your perspective on race? Like, was there ever a time when you didn't have a clue that you were a color? Like, was there ever a time when,
Like when I didn't know I was black in America.
yeah, or that was a thing? What was it like as maybe a child? Like, do you have a memory of knowing that everybody's exactly the same, and then an occurrence when you realize that color was part of identity and it was given value by those around you, and then you ultimately attribute value to it as a human develops intellectually.
Well, I think growing up black in America, it's not a question of coming to the realization. It's sort of parents know, especially black parents know that unless you teach your child this at a young age, you're not teaching them how to survive, right? So it is a matter of sort of in real cases of life and death, how to navigate a world in which you are treated differently. So for us growing up, it was like breathing, right? Like Liza was talking about when she was talking about our friends, just talking about, black people don't do this, white people do this, or whatever. That was sort of as common as asking the question of how are you doing today, right? Whether it be your grandparents, your parents, whatever, it was you lived it. And also, from my parents, they understood that they have to make sure from an early age that my brother and I grow up with a positive sense of blackness, but also understanding that you're never limited by your blackness. So it wasn't the the hard thing that I had to learn was not how to be black. It was how to negotiate the landfills of being black in America, right? So it wasn't an awakening to that I'm black. It was an awakening to the real life repercussions of what that means throughout my life. That was always sort of the touchstone. But for me growing up, it was always you have a moral obligation to make the world better. Like you are part of a history of people who suffer or face depression, both past and currently. You now have that obligation to carry that weight for what you do to make things better moving forward. So that was a cornerstone all, ever since I can remember.
Into it. So when I was 10, we had just gone to South Africa on a family vacation to visit a woman that my mom grew up knowing as a foreign exchange student when she was in high school. And they had stayed in touch over all these years. So we went to visit her and her family, and we went into the slums, into Soweto. We went into the places of great wealth. We sort of did a exploratory learning of what happened in South Africa with apartheid and then peace and reconciliation that had happened thereafter and was continuing at the time. And when I was exposed to Soweto, where it was predominantly, um, it's a place of where all Black people were put together there, separated by purely poverty. It was put in place to divide the community. I'm listening to Trevor Noah's book right now on Born a Crime is his book that's a couple years old, and it is very insightful, especially during this time, to understand what happened in South Africa and how that might apply to what's happened in America as well. And Soweto is this place where there's high poverty rates, and they hardly have tin roofs over their heads. And it broke my heart as a 10-year-old, totally unable to understand what was going on here and why there was such poverty, but yet there was such joyfulness as well. And every single person we walked by seemed very happy in their own space, whether they're interacting with us or not, but they appeared to be joyful in the moments that we were walking through and on our mission. And it was an interesting time for me to consider what it's like to have and have not, what it's like to consider community, styles of community, ways of living and expressing, ways of finding joyfulness where they are and where they're not. And I came back and was basically forever impacted and changed by that experience, and wrote, one of my 10-year-old poems, as you do, and learning all about Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. And that was the first time I realized what it was to have privilege and power as a white person, especially in America. And it was a hard time to try to understand that. I'm not sure I was intellectually even ready for it. And I'm still not, I'm still in this space of trying to understand and trying to increase empathy, but we all can only operate from, where we are and who we are and what experiences life has taught us by our learned experiences. What are your thoughts, Quentin, on, how does this movement feel similar or different from times when America has rallied to elevate the voice of Black people in America?
How do I think that this might be different?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important not always to look at it as how is it different, because there are differences, right? But I think it's important to understand that this is part of an outrage that's connected to a long history of struggle and oppression. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if the movement is different from, the demands are different, the way in which it sparks are different. But if you see this as an outrage from systematic oppression, a system of neoliberal capitalism, a system of militarizing the police, and that being a continuation of a long history, then you see that this is merely the new generation carrying a new torch for the same fires that America never put out. And that's the thing. I mean, one thing that you can say that is different is I think that this killing has hit white America in a different way than previous killings have, so that the protests are far more diverse than previous protests. And I think that's a sign that you're seeing a different level of awakening than previous movements, right? And so I think that's an important thing to notice the difference. But it's also important to realize you don't have the abolition of slavery. You don't have the fighting against Jim Crow without also whites who were there fighting, dying for those causes as well. And I think that that's the understanding. But the thing, too, that I think is important is that this killing has to be put in a different context and a different frame than previous deaths. Not previous as in the last 20 years, previous as in, like, let's say the lynching, right? I think this is tied far deeper to a larger system than simply Jim Crow. Now, it's not saying Jim Crow wasn't systematic or horrific. It absolutely was. But I think with that, you had the clear lynching, getting rid of lynching laws. In this case, what you have is, how are you going to rethink systematically the way in which we police, the way in which poverty is structured in the United States, the way in which there's a vast, inequality in wealth, which is systematically putting people in poverty and putting people of color disproportionately poor in poverty. And I think that is something that we have to wrestle with differently about this movement, is that the way in which the system works is quite different and has to be analyzed in previous times. It's not simply an incident of, a Black man being basically lynched in the street by a cop putting his knee on the throat. That happened, and it's absolutely horrific. But why is it that you have the over-policing of these areas? Why is it that you have not only disproportionate policing in Black community, but also police brutality amongst poor people in general?
With this latest valuable episode, we'd love to thank you for joining us on the Creating Community for Good podcast. If you found today's show valuable, simply visit our website, creatingcommunityforgood.com, to leave a review, as well as to get access to additional resources and relevant links from this show. Stay tuned for more episodes.